Rồi. Được chưa? Này được chưa? Lẩm bẩm nữa. Rồi, được rồi.
You are a slave within Caligula's palace. You have just been called to the dining chamber, not to serve, not to clean. You do not know the reason, and that is the part that has kept you awake for 2 years. Not what he does when he is angry, what he does when he is in a good mood. The door opens. He is laughing. He sees you standing there. The laughter does not cease, and in that instant you realize that whatever is about to happen has nothing to do with anything you have done. Gasp. Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. The world knew him as Caligula, and he left behind one remark that explains everything that followed. Suetonius recorded it directly. Caligula said, "Remember that I have the right to do anything to anybody." He did not say it in anger. He stated it as a fact, as a man states the weather or the time of day. When he came to power in 37 AD, Rome celebrated.
The reign of Tiberius had been suffocating, paranoid, cruel in the precise way that political fear produces cruelty. When Caligula arrived at 24 years old, citizens flooded into the streets. In his first months, he released unjustly imprisoned people, abolished oppressive taxes, and staged games that filled the city with relief. For a brief moment, Rome believed it had been saved. Then he became gravely ill near the end of 37 AD. No one knows exactly what the illness was. What everyone who was close to him recorded was what followed. The man who recovered was not the man who had fallen sick. Something that had been restrained was no longer restrained. Tiberius had seen it coming. Before Caligula ever took power, Tiberius reportedly said he was raising a viper for the Roman people. He had watched the boy grow up inside the palace. He had seen what lived beneath the surface. The illness did not create what came next. It stripped away whatever thin layer had been containing it.
And the people who had no way out of that palace, the thousands of slaves who lived and worked inside those walls, were the first to understand what that meant. Caligula kept an executioner on constant standby inside the palace, not stationed at a prison, not assigned to a military post, positioned near the dining chamber, ready to be summoned at any moment during a meal. Suetonius recorded this without elaboration, because the fact itself required none. Guests came to dinner at the imperial palace. They reclined to the table. They were served food. They were poured wine. And at some point during the evening, prisoners were brought from the palace cells into the dining room. Not swiftly handled and removed, handled slowly, deliberately, while the food was still on the table. Caligula watched. His guests continued eating. That was the requirement. Not to look away, not to excuse themselves, to remain at the table.
Và treat what was happening beside them as an ordinary feature of the evening. He said it himself. He told people directly that watching suffering sharpened his appetite. He said it at the table in front of guests, as a man might mention that he preferred his wine from a certain region. No one responded. No one could. Then there was the slave who took a strip of silver from a couch. The theft was small. The response was not about the theft. Caligula had the slave brought into the dining room while guests were present. He ordered both of the slaves' hands cut off at the table. Then he had those hands fastened around the slave's own neck, so they hung against his chest. Then he had the man walked in a slow circuit around every table in the room. A placard was carried before him explaining what he had done. The guests watched him pass. The slave completed the full circuit. Then it was finished, and the evening continued.
Every other slave in that room was still working, still carrying dishes, still refilling cups. They moved through that room with their eyes lowered and their hands steady, while a man walked past them with his own hands hanging from his neck. They had no choice but to keep moving, stopping, reacting, showing anything on their face was its own kind of risk. That is what made Caligula different from the cruelty that came before him. It was not only what he did, it was the company he did it in. He required witnesses. He required the people around him to absorb what they were seeing and perform complete normalcy in response. The slaves who worked those dinners performed that normalcy night after night. They became experts at revealing nothing on their faces while everything around them fell apart. That skill was the only thing keeping them alive. The dining room was the private face. The arena was the public one.
And what Caligula did in public followed the same logic as what he did at the table. He needed witnesses. He needed the horror to have an audience. During one afternoon at the gladiatorial games, Caligula grew tired of the scheduled entertainment. The trained fighters were removed from the arena. In their place, he sent whoever was available, the elderly and the physically weak, slaves from the palace household, men who had no combat training and nothing in their hands. Suetonius recorded this. Caligula watched from his seat while people who had no ability to defend themselves were placed into that space, and he observed the result with the same focus he gave to everything else he arranged. He had the awnings drawn back first. The afternoon sun in Rome in summer is not gentle. He gave orders that no one in the stands was permitted to leave. They sat in the heat, and they watched what he had decided they would watch.
If anyone's reaction did not satisfy him, if the applause was too thin, if the enthusiasm appeared unconvincing, the consequences followed. There was a moment during separate games when a gladiator received his freedom through a gesture from another fighter. The crowd responded warmly. Caligula stormed from the amphitheater in visible rage. He had nearly stumbled on his toga on the steps going down, which made the humiliation worse. The crowd had honored the act of granting a man his freedom. That response, more than his own entrance, had drawn the warmest reaction of the afternoon. He did not forget it. He also had writers and performers punished physically if their work fell short of what he required. Not dismissed, not fined, beaten with rods or thrown into rivers. This applied in Rome and in the provinces. A performance in Gaul that did not produce sufficient praise resulted in the performers being flogged. The standard was unseen until you failed to reach it.
Caligula once looked out at a crowd in the amphitheater and openly declared he wished all of Rome shared a single neck. Cassius still recorded it. He said it publicly to the crowd he was addressing. It was not a flash of rage. It was a statement of preference, a description of how he viewed the people around him, every single one of them. Caligula built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baia. It stretched nearly 2 miles across open water. He crossed it on horseback, wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he had reportedly taken from Alexander's tomb. The spectacle was enormous. The purpose of it, most historians concluded, was the spectacle itself. But what Suetonius recorded about the celebration that followed is what belongs here. Caligula invited people to come aboard the ships and celebrate with him. They came. He was their emperor, and he had invited them. Once they were gathered away from the shore, surrounded by water, he had them thrown overboard.
Some managed to grasp the rudders of nearby ships. They clung on. Caligula had both hooks and oars brought out. He stood and watched as his men moved along the sides of the ships, using the poles to push people away from the hulls and back into the water. One by one, deliberately, he watched until they were gone. The men using those poles were oarsmen. They were slaves. They obeyed the orders they were given. Slaves in that world obeyed every order because disobedience was not a real option. But what those orders required of them was to push a drowning person back into the water and hold their place while that person died. This is the category of thing that living inside Caligula's service produced, not only surviving what he did to you, becoming the instrument of what he did to others. He did something similar with a gladiator during a sparring session. The man was practicing with Caligula in the arena.
At a certain point, the gladiator fell, yielded, lowered himself to the ground in the recognized gesture of submission. The fight was over. Caligula drew a real blade and stabbed the man while he lay at his feet. Then he walked the arena with a palm branch raised, the symbol of victory. The man had surrendered. That was the moment Caligula chose. Submission was not safety. Doing exactly what was expected could be the thing that killed you. There is one incident Suetonius recorded that cuts differently from the others, not because it involved greater violence, but because of what it required from the people watching. Caligula had a man's son executed. Then he sent for the father that same day. The father received an imperial summons, the dinner at the palace, and he came because refusing an imperial summons was its own kind of death. He sat at the table. He was served food. He was poured wine.
Then Caligula turned to him and told him to be cheerful, to laugh, to enjoy the evening, to perform contentment at the emperor's table on the same day he had watched his son die. And the father did it. Suetonius recorded this without further commentary. The man performed happiness. He laughed when it was required of him. He kept his grief entirely inside his body for the duration of that dinner, because the alternative was to join his son. As every slave working that table saw it, they moved through that room carrying dishes. They refilled the father's cup while he smiled at whatever Caligula said. They kept their faces still and their movements steady, and they did not allow what they were witnessing to appear anywhere on them, because they had been doing that for years by then, watching things unfold at those tables and making themselves invisible inside the act of watching. This was the daily reality of the palace.
Not only their own fear of what he might do to them, the unending witnessing of what he did to everyone around them, watching people endure unbearable things and display the opposite, understanding that the performance was the only currency available and having to perform it themselves every single day while serving the man who made it necessary. Caligula had a philosophy about this. He quoted it directly. Let them hate so long as they fear. It was not an impulse he was acting on. It was a deliberate position, a calculated approach to the people around him. You have just seen what he did in public, at the table, in the arena. Before witnesses, he forced to remain silent. What happened behind the sealed sections of that palace? the parts he kept from public record, was documented by those who had no reason to embellish. It was worse. The imperial palace had many wings. Most of them served familiar functions: dining halls, audience chambers, private quarters. But
during Caligula's reign, Suetonius documented that certain rooms were transformed into something else entirely, something that had no precedent among Roman emperors before him. And as the treasury emptied, drained by his games, his spectacles, his projects, his daily excess, Caligula opened sections of the palace to paying visitors, not as a museum, not as a site for official functions. He filled those rooms with women drawn from the households of Rome's most prominent families, wives of senators, wives of equestrians, women of status, of rank, of families that had served Rome for generations. They were not asked, they were ordered, and their husbands, who sat in the Senate and commanded legions in governed provinces, sent them in, because the alternative was to make an enemy of the man who decided whether they lived or died. The slaves who worked in those sections of the palace moved through it daily. They prepared the rooms. They carried messages.
Họ cleaned afterward, yet họ existed within it, you as permanent witnesses. Họ could speak to no one about what they had seen. And some of them, họ không only witnesses. Some of the enslaved women of the household, họ among those used in those rooms with even less protection than the noble women who at least carry the weight of their family name. Suetonius, họ also recorded what Caligula did at dinner after summoning a senator's wife from the table. He would leave mid-meal, or he would return, and then he would recount to the table in measured detail what had taken place. He assessed the woman in front of her husband. He pointed out what he found lacking. He compared her to others. He did this calmly, the way a man discusses a transaction that has ended to his satisfaction. The husband sat at the table.
The husband listened as the slaves serving that dinner kept moving through the room with their eyes forward, while the man whose wife had just been dismantled, in words, sat 2 feet away, performing composure. They had witnessed versions of this before. That was the most unsettling part. By then they had seen enough that nothing startled them anymore. That kind of numbness is not peace. It is damage accumulated so gradually that the person carrying it stops noticing the weight. You are still in the palace. It is January 24th, 41 AD. 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days have passed since the streets of Rome filled with people celebrating the start of his reign. The marble corridors look the same as they always have. To lamplight falls the same way on the same stone. But you have learned to read this building the way you read a person's face. You know which sounds mean he is nearby. You know the difference between silence that is safe and silence that is not.
today he attended the Palatine Games. He was in a good mood. He watched performances, ate well, moved through the afternoon with the ease of a man who had no reason to expect the day to unfold any other way than he wished. Now he is moving through the covered passage that connects the theater complex to the palace, the same passage you have walked yourself 100 times, carrying dishes, carrying messages, keeping your eyes on the floor. Correa was a tribune of the Praetorian Guard. He had served under Caligula with the particular strain of a man who had no way to leave. Caligula had humiliated Correa in ways that were public and deliberate. He mocked Correa's voice in front of other soldiers. He forced him to receive passwords that were meant to degrade him and made gestures at him that diminished him before the men he commanded. Correa had absorbed every instance of it, the way everyone inside that palace absorbed everything in silence. with his face still waiting. He had not been waiting alone. Ding! The conspiracy included Praetorian officers and men of senatorial rank. The plan was not complex. In the covered passage, away from the crowd, they would act. Caligula stepped forward. The first blow struck Caligula in the shoulder. He did not fall. Yet he turned and tried to move. The passage was narrow, and the men at both ends were part of what was unfolding. Suetonius recorded that he received 30 wounds before it was over. He did not die the way he had made others die, with an audience required to applaud. He died in a corridor, on stone, surrounded by men who had decided that surviving him was worth whatever followed. His Germanic bodyguards, enslaved and freed men of Germanic origin who had been personally attached to him, reached the passage after it was done. Some of them attacked the conspirators, not under any order, not because they had been instructed to. They had served no emperor before him.
He the only authority they had ever known, and its sudden absence produced something in them that expressed itself as violence before anything else could reach them. You hear it from where you are standing. The sound moves through the palace the way all sounds travel through stone buildings. Then silence. Not the silence of waiting for something to happen, the silence of something already concluded. You do not move, not yet. You have been inside these walls long enough to know that the end of one dangerous thing is not the same as safety. You have seen what happens to people who celebrate too soon. So you remain still. You wait. You keep your face exactly as it has always been. The Senate met in the hours after the assassination and debated whether to restore the Republic. They argued through the night. They did not restore it. Claudius was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace by Praetorian guards. He was carried out and declared emperor before the Senate finished arguing.
Yet the transition from one reign to the next took hours. For the slaves of the imperial household, nothing changed in law. They were property before the assassination and property after it. They transferred with the palace to Claudius the way the furniture transferred. The legal reality of their lives was identical the morning after Caligula's death to what it had been the morning before. What changed was this specific texture of the fear, his particular appetites, his precise unpredictability. That version of danger was gone. What replaced it was simply unknown. Cassius Caria, who had struck the first blow, was executed by Claudius shortly afterward, not out of grief for Caligula, but out of the logic of the institution. An emperor who allowed the killing of his predecessor to pass without consequence was an emperor who had confirmed that killing emperors was a viable act. Caria had ended the reign and was then consumed by the same system he had tried to disrupt.
The slaves who lived through all of it left no record of their own. Roman society did not grant them the means to record their experience. They appear in the historical texts only in the moments when something was done to them, named in no account, quoted nowhere, present in every scene, and absent from every testimony. Caligula ruled for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. He was 28 years old when he died in that passage. He had governed an empire of tens of millions of people and left it financially drained, structurally intact, and deeply relieved to be righted him. Suetonius wrote about his reign in detail. Cassius Dio wrote about it. They were not writing to warn future generations or to construct a moral lesson.
Họ wrote because what happened inside that palace during those 4 years stood outside the recognized limits of what Roman civilization, a civilization that accepted slavery, accepted public execution, accepted cruelty as a feature of governance, considered normal behavior. Even by the standards of a world built on the ownership of human beings, what Caligula did required documentation. The plain record was disturbing enough. It did not need embellishment then. It is not needed now. The slaves who moved through every scene of it left nothing behind in their own words. No account of what it felt like to carry dishes through that dining room. No record of what it cost to keep a face still on a man walked past with his own hands hanging from his neck. No testimony from the people who cleaned those rooms, who heard those sounds through walls, who stood at those doors and understood exactly what was happening on the other side.
History preserved the names of the men who watched from the other side of the room. It did not preserve the people who were closest to all of it. Caligula believed he had the right to do anything to anybody. He said so himself. He died in a corridor. 30 wounds, 28 years old. The slaves who survived him were transferred to the next emperor with the palace.